As we continue our walk through the book of Ephesians, chapter 4, we looked yesterday at the walk that the Lord does not want us to have. And remember in chapter 4, verse 1, He has called us to a worthy walk, to walk in a manner worthy of Christ. We saw yesterday, as we looked at chapter 4, verse 17, that we're not to walk as the Gentiles walk, or the unbelievers who have been hardened by sin, who are their minds are darkened, they're calloused towards the things of God, and they've given themselves over to all sorts of sinful practices. But he says in verse 20, we have not learned Christ that way. Then he goes on to talk about how we have learned Christ and what it means to walk worthily of the Lord. So in verse 21, he picks it up and he says, if indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, just as truth is in Jesus. So he is assuming that they are believers, and most likely the people that are reading this particular letter are believers, but you never know. But he plays it out there and he says, look, if you've heard of him, if you've heard the gospel, if you know about Jesus Christ and you've been taught in him, so you understand at least the fundamental basic doctrines about Christ, and that truth is in Jesus, if all that is true, and so now you have turned from the way of the Gentiles here, the unbelieving culture around you, and you are now living out the truth that is found in Jesus. If that is true, he says, verse 22, then something should happen in your life in a very practical way. And here we come to verses 22 to 24 at what is often called the put off, put on principle. How do you live the Christian life in such a way that is honoring to the Lord? Well, you put off the way you used to live, you put on the way Christ wants you to live, and you are renewed in the spirit of your mind. So that's what he says in these verses. Let's jump into them. Verse 22, but in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and put on the new self, which is in the likeness of God, has been created in righteousness and the holiness of the truth. So let's back up and take a look at this. In verse 22, we'll start again kind of with the negative. And keep in mind, the picture is here of putting off clothing and putting on clothing. So he's using that as kind of a metaphor that drives his narrative here. So he wants us to, like we change clothing. So we put off something and we put on something else. And so that's the picture that he's giving. So follow that in your thinking as we go through. That in reference to your former manner of life. Now he's just described their former manner of life. He has talked about that in verses 17, 18, and 19, and talked about the hardness of heart, the darkness of mind, the callousness towards the things of God, the giving themselves over to sensuality and other sins. So that's their former manner of life. So in regards to that, he says, I want you to lay aside the old self. The old self then is what we used to be. It's the life we used to live, the one he's just described. And then he says, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit. So in the old self, some people call it the old nature. The scripture, I think, scriptures speak more of the flesh, and we'll look at that more as we go forward. But he is saying here, look, that old self, there's nothing good in that old self. That doesn't mean that unbelievers can't do good things and nice things and kind things. That's possible, but we can never walk in a manner worthy of the Lord in our old self. That old self is being corrupted. It's already corrupt. It's apparently in a spiral downhill in corruption as well, with the lust of deceit. Lust is desires, and so we have these desires and living in deceitful ways. He says, I want you to put that off. That is not how you ought to be living for the Lord. Instead, you are, he says, to be, at verse 24, putting on the new self, and in verse 23, you're to have your mind renewed. So if we're going to walk with the Lord in a manner worthy of him, we have to realize what we have been saved from, and that we no longer want to live that way. And so we're going to put that off, he says. We're going to put those things aside. We're going to consider those things dead to us, and we're not going to live that way any longer. Instead, we're going to live a new way according to the new nature that he's given us, as we'll see tomorrow. And in the process of doing that, we also have to have our minds renewed. When we get this nailed down and begin to put some flesh on the bones on this particular principle of living, we begin to have a life that does honor the Lord. And we do have a wonderful day in the Lord and a wonderful life in the Lord. So we'll look at more of this, especially on the positive side tomorrow.